313 men stood between the survival of Islam and its erasure. Not 3,000, not 1,000, 313 against 950. Some of them had no sandals. Some had never held a sword before that morning. They had 2 horses between them. The sun over the Valley of Badr was already climbing, and the earth beneath their feet was still cool, and every single one of them knew they might not live to see it set. And yet, when Rasulullah looked back at his army, what he saw was not fear. What he saw was something that no military general, no conqueror, no emperor in all of history had ever assembled in one place. Something that would change the world before the day was over. The year was 624 CE, the second year after the Hijrah, the month of Ramadan, and what was about to happen at a small watering station called Badr was not merely a battle. Scholars of Sirah have said it for 14 centuries, and it remains true. Badr was the moment Islam became real, not just as a message, not just as a community, but as a force that the world could no longer ignore. If the Muslims had fallen that day, the early Ummah would have been shattered. The Quraysh would have finished what they started, and everything that came after, every masjid built, every Quran recited, every shahada whispered across 1,000 years, might never have existed. But to understand what happened at Badr, you cannot begin at Badr. You have to go back further, to a decision made in Makkah, a decision driven not by honor or courage, but by something far more revealing: greed. The Quraysh had a problem. After driving the Muslims out of Makkah, after the Hijrah, after years of torture, economic siege and persecution, they found themselves holding something that did not belong to them. The property, the belongings, the wealth of the Muhajirin. The Muslims who had fled to Medina had left everything behind. Some had left in the middle of the night with nothing but the clothes on their backs. The Quraysh took what remained, bundled it into a trade caravan, and sent it north to Syria to be sold. The profits were earmarked for one purpose: preparing for war against the very people they had robbed. 1,000 camels, goods worth 50,000 dinars. The caravan was led by Abu Sufyan, one of the most experienced and calculating men in the Quraysh leadership. And when Rasulullah received intelligence about this caravan, about what it carried, who was behind it, and what the profits would fund, the decision was clear. The caravan had to be intercepted. He did not order a general mobilization. He did not demand that every man in Medina take up arms. He said simply, "Whoever has a riding animal, come with us." It was, at that moment, intended to be an interception, not a battle. But Abu Sufyan was not a man who waited to be caught. He had informants, he had scouts, and the moment he learned that the Muslims were moving toward his route, he sent a messenger galloping toward Makkah with a single urgent message: "The caravan is under threat. Come now, come armed." The messenger arrived in Makkah, screaming through the streets, tearing at his collar, a traditional Arab signal of catastrophe, warning that everything was at risk. The response was immediate. Every family in Makkah had wealth in that caravan. Fear and fury swept the city. Within hours, an army began to form. Not a raiding party, not an escort force, an army. 950 men, 100 horsemen, 700 camels loaded with supplies. Musicians and singers were brought along because Abu Jahl, who would command the expedition, intended this to feel like a celebration before it began. And then, before they even reached Badr, Abu Sufyan sent word: "The caravan is safe. It reached Makkah by an alternate route. You can go home." Most men would have turned back. The original purpose was gone, but Abu Jahl was not most men. He stood before the army and said, "We press on. We go to Badr. We stay 3 days. We slaughter camels. We drink. The Arab tribes will see us and know our power. And if Muhammad comes, we will end this." He convinced them. 950 men continued their march, and what they were walking toward was not the easy victory Abu Jahl had promised them. When news reached Rasulullah that the caravan had escaped and that an army of nearly 1,000 was now marching toward Badr, he gathered the Sahaba. He laid out what they were facing, and he asked. He did not command. He asked. One of the Muhajirin, Miqdad ibn Aswad, stood first. His words were direct. We will not say what Bani Israel said to Musa, go, you and your Lord, and fight while we sit here. No, we fight beside you. Wherever you go, we go. The Prophet was moved, visibly. But the Ansar were also in that gathering, the people of Medina, who had pledged to protect him within the city. Would they follow him into a confrontation outside it? Sa'd ibn Mu'adh rose, one of the leaders of the Ansar, and he said, perhaps you are speaking of us. We believed in you. We testified to your truth. We gave you our pledge to hear and to obey. Go where Allah commands you, Messenger of Allah. We are with you. The worry on the face of Rasulullah disappeared. He said, Allah has promised me one of the two things, either the caravan or victory, and I can already see the places where certain men of Quraysh will fall. 313 men, ready, moving toward Badr under the Ramadan sun, with 2 horses, 70 camels, and a certainty about their Lord that no army in history has ever carried quite the same way. Among them was a boy named Umayr ibn Abi Waqqas, 16 years old, too young technically to be permitted to march. He knew it. So he tried to hide. He tucked himself into the ranks and kept his head low, hoping Rasulullah would not notice. But the Prophet saw him and said gently, go back. You are too young. Umayr wept. He wept so hard, so openly, that the Prophet could not send him away. He relented. And Umayr's brother Sa'd tied a sword around him, a sword so long it dragged on the ground as Umayr walked, because his body had not yet grown into the weapon. He walked to Badr with his sword leaving a line in the sand behind him. He would not walk home from it. The army reached the valley before the Quraysh did, and the question of positioning became critical. Rasulullah had chosen a spot near the wells of Badr. Then a companion named Hubab ibn al-Mundhir, 30 years old, sharp in military strategy, approached him and asked a question that required courage to ask. He said, did Allah instruct you to choose this position, or was it your own strategic judgment? The Prophet said, my own judgment. Hubab said, then with your permission, this is not the best ground. Move us closer to the well nearest to the Quraysh's approach. We build a reservoir there, fill it with water, then seal the other wells. We drink freely. They suffer thirst. The Prophet agreed immediately. The plan was adopted in full, and there, in the way he received that counsel without ego, without claiming prophetic authority over a military decision that was simply his, there was a lesson that would echo through every generation of Islamic leadership that came after. By nightfall, the army was positioned, the wells were secured, and the Sahaba slept, all of them except one. Except Rasulullah stood through the night in Salah, in dua, hands raised, voice low, saying, O Allah, if this small group is destroyed tonight, there will be no one left on earth to worship you. He was not bargaining. He was not afraid. He was doing what he always did, turning entirely toward his Lord. And in Surah Al-Anfal, Allah would later record his answer to that prayer. Remember when you asked your Lord for help, and he responded, I will reinforce you with 1,000 angels, rank upon rank. Morning came over Badr. The Quraysh army arrived at the valley as the light was still pale on the horizon. 950 men, fully armed, camels loaded, the sound of drums moving with them through the desert air. And then they saw it, the Muslim position. Already established, already fortified around the wells, the strategic ground taken before they had even arrived. A ripple of unease moved through the Quraysh ranks, but numbers have a way of quieting doubt. They looked across at 313, and the doubt passed. What came next was not unique to that morning. It was ancient Arab custom. Before the armies met, individual champions would step forward to fight. One man against one man, or 3 against 3, in a duel called Mubaraza. The outcome of these single combats was considered a sign, a reading of which side carried the stronger will. 3 men stepped out from the Quraysh line. Utbah ibn Rabi'ah, his brother Shayba, and Utba's son, Walid. These were not ordinary fighters. They came from one of Quraysh's most powerful families, the Banu Umayyah, and they carried with them years of deep, festering rivalry against the Prophet's own clan, Banu Hashim. They had come to Badr for many reasons, but standing in that open ground between the two armies, swords in hand, they had come for this moment specifically. 3 young men from the Ansar rushed forward to meet them. They were willing. They were ready. Utbah stopped them. He looked them over and said loudly, across the space between the armies, "Who are you?" Then he called back toward the Muslim line, "Send us men who are our equals." It was a calculated insult, dressed as protocol. What Utbah wanted was men from Banu Hashim. He wanted the fight to be personal. He wanted blood from the family of the Prophet. Rasulullah called the young Ansar back and sent forward 3 men, Ubaidah ibn al-Harith, Hamza ibn Abd al-Muttalib, Ali ibn Abi Talib. All 3 were from the Prophet's own family. All 3 were among the most formidable fighters the Muslim army had. Utbah saw them and finally nodded. The duels began. Hamza moved against Shayba. Ali moved against Walid. In both cases, it was over quickly, with a precision and force that the Quraysh had not anticipated. But across from them, Ubaidah and Utbah were locked in something harder. Both men struck. Both men bled. The rule of Mubaraza permitted a fighter who had won his duel to go help his brother. So Hamza and Ali finished their opponents and moved immediately to Ubaidah. Together they brought Utbah down. They carried Ubaidah back to where Rasulullah stood. He was badly wounded. Blood covered his lower body. But the question he asked, lying there, was not about pain. It was not about whether he would survive. He said, "Am I not a shaheed, O Messenger of Allah?" The Prophet said, "Yes, Ubaidah, you are a shaheed." And peace settled over his face. He died within moments, and he died smiling. Because for the companions of Badr, dying in the path of Allah was not an ending. It was an arrival. The 3 champions of Quraysh lay in the dust. The strongest men they had sent forward, gone before the main battle had even begun. Abu Jahl, watching from his position, understood what this meant for the morale of his army. He shouted across the field that the deaths of Utbah, Shayba, and Walid meant nothing, that the Muslims were nothing but a handful easily swallowed. That victory was still certain and still close. He was trying to stop something that had already begun, the quiet fracturing of 950 men who had expected an easy morning. Then the battle began in full. What Rasulullah did next is something that later made Ali ibn Abi Talib stop mid-sentence when he tried to describe it. Ali, who himself became synonymous with battlefield courage, said that on the day of Badr, the bravest man present, the one who stood closest to the enemy, the one who advanced most deeply into danger, was the Prophet himself. He did not command from behind the lines. He did not direct from distance. He fought. He pushed forward. He gave his companions courage not just through words, but through his own body, moving ahead of theirs into the thickest part of the battle. While the swords clashed and the arrows flew, Rasulullah reached down and took a handful of dust from the earth. He turned toward the Quraysh and threw it in their direction, saying words of dua as he released it. Every grain of that dust, according to what Allah would later reveal in Surah Al-Anfal, did not fly by his hand. You did not throw when you threw, but Allah threw. The dust reached the faces of men across a distance no handful of earth could naturally cross. Eyes stung, vision blurred. The Quraysh formation began to break at the edges. Then the wind came, and then another wind. And with those winds, though no Qurayshi eye could see them, came what Allah had promised in his answer to the night prayer at Badr. 1,000 angels, rank upon rank, not metaphorically, not symbolically. The Quran records it plainly, and the Seerah preserves accounts of companions who saw things on that battlefield they could not explain in ordinary terms. Shadows at the periphery, sounds that had no source, forces pressing against the enemy that no Muslim sword accounted for. The Quraysh had come to Badr to feel powerful. They had come with drums and singers and the certainty of numbers. What they encountered instead was a force that numbers could not measure and weapons could not stop. Amid the chaos, the man most responsible for dragging the army to this field, Abu Jahl, was now trying to find somewhere to stand that wasn't collapsing around him. He had said, before the battle, "Muhammad and his companions are nothing but an easy bite." He had said it to 950 men with horses and armor and blades. Now the field was in chaos. His champions were dead, his formation was shattered, and his name was being called by two young men from the Ansar who had heard what he had done to the honor of Rasulullah. Their names were Muad and Muawid, sons of Afra. Neither of them was a seasoned veteran. They were young, burning with something that had nothing to do with strategy or military ambition. They approached Abd al-Rahman ibn Auf on the field and asked him, "Point out Abu Jahl to us." When Ibn Auf asked why, one of them said simply, "I heard he insults Rasulullah. I swear by Allah, if I see him, one of us will not leave this field alive." Ibn Auf pointed. Both of them ran. Abu Jahl saw them coming and laughed. He said, "Foolish boys running toward their own death." He was still laughing when Muad's sword took his leg. He was still defiant when Abu Jahl's son Ikrimah cut Muad down in response. He was still fighting when Muawid fell. And then, with a wound that would have stopped most men, Muad dragged himself forward on the ground and struck again, and Abu Jahl fell. He did not die immediately. Abdullah ibn Masud found him still breathing, still conscious, still carrying the same arrogance he had brought to Badr from Makkah. Ibn Masud stepped on his neck, and Abu Jahl looked up at him and asked, "Who won today?" Ibn Masud said, "Allah and his messenger," and with that, he ended it. What came next belongs to the category of things that are difficult to explain unless you already believe, and impossible to dismiss even if you do not. Before the battle, Rasulullah had walked along the ground at Badr and pointed, "Here, this man will fall. Here, this one. Here." He named them. He showed the spots with his hand. And when the battle was over and the dead were gathered, Umar ibn al-Khattab later swore, by the one who sent him with the truth, that not one of the men the Prophet had named fell anywhere other than the precise spot he had indicated. The Quraysh army broke, not gradually, not in an organized retreat where officers called their men back in formation. It collapsed, men dropping weapons, turning, running, each one looking for distance between himself and what was happening on that field. The army that had arrived at Badr with drums and singers and absolute certainty of victory was now scattering across the valley floor in every direction. Surah Al-Qamar had foretold it in Makkah years before it happened, when the Muslims were still a tiny, persecuted community being tortured in the streets. Their group will soon be defeated and will turn their backs in flight. Those words had been revealed when the very idea of the Muslims winning anything seemed impossible, when they were outnumbered, outarmed, boycotted, starved. And yet there it was, not as a hope or a prayer, but as a statement of fact delivered before the fact existed. By the time the Battle of Badr confirmed it, the ayah had been sitting in the hearts of the believers for years, waiting. 14 Muslims were killed at Badr, 14, against an army that had come to erase the religion. Among them was young Umayr ibn Abi Waqas, who had wept at the thought of being left behind, whose sword had dragged a line in the sand on the walk to the valley. He was among the first to fall, and the companions who survived, who would carry the designation Ashab Badr, the people of Badr, for the rest of their lives, understood what that title meant. It meant they had been present at the moment the scales tipped. It meant they had stood in the place where Islam proved it would not disappear. 70 Qurayshi fighters were killed. Another 70 were taken as prisoners. The question of what to do with those prisoners became one of the most consequential deliberations in early Islamic governance. Rasulullah consulted his companions. Abu Bakr al-Siddiq said, "These are our cousins and our kin. accept ransom from them, and release them. Perhaps Allah will guide them to Islam. Umar ibn al-Khattab said something harder. These men have spent their lives fighting the truth. Give each man his relative to execute. Make clear that we have no loyalty to those who war against Allah and His Messenger. The Prophet heard both. He accepted the counsel of Abu Bakr. The prisoners would be offered release, either through paying ransom or, for those who had no wealth, through teaching 10 children of Medina to read and write. That second option tells you something about what Rasulullah valued. At the height of a military victory, with prisoners kneeling before him, his concern extended to the literacy of children. Knowledge, in his understanding, was not a luxury to be negotiated after security was established. It was part of the foundation of security itself. Among those prisoners was a man whose ransom negotiation became something else entirely. Al-Abbas ibn Abd al-Muttalib, the Prophet's own uncle, had fought on the side of Quraysh. He was now among the captured. When he told Rasulullah that he had no money to pay his ransom, the Prophet said, "What about the gold you gave to Fadl before you left Makkah? The gold you divided for her, and for Fadl, and for Abdullah, and for Kuthum, telling her, if something happens to me on this journey, this is for you, and this portion is for each of them." Abbas went still. He said, "O Messenger of Allah, no one knew that. No one was present except me and Fadl. Who told you?" The Prophet said, "Allah told me." In that moment, something settled inside Abbas that had been unsettled for a long time. He would return to Makkah after his release. He would keep what he now believed hidden for years, secretly supporting the Muslims, sending intelligence to Rasulullah about Qurayshi movements and plans. His faith, planted at Badr by a conversation about a secret only Allah could have known, would endure until it could finally be declared openly. Another prisoner presented a different kind of challenge. Suhail ibn Amr was one of the most gifted orators in Quraysh, a man whose words could move crowds, stiffen resolve, and sharpen hatred against the Muslims. He had used that gift against Islam for years. When Umar saw him among the captives, he went to Rasulullah and made a direct request. "Let me pull out his 2 front teeth so that he can never again speak against you. His tongue is a weapon. Disable it." The Prophet said, "Leave him, Umar. It is hoped that he will reach a position that will please you." Umar did not understand it then. He accepted it because it was the Prophet speaking, but the logic escaped him. Years later, after the conquest of Makkah, after Suhail had eventually accepted Islam, on the day Rasulullah passed from this world, when Makkah was paralyzed with grief and disbelief, when people could not find words or footing in a world suddenly without him, it was Suhail ibn Amr who stood before the people and spoke. The same voice that had once been raised against Islam was now the voice that steadied the Ummah at its most devastated moment. He reminded them. He calmed them. He gave them what they needed to keep standing. And Umar, standing in that crowd, finally understood what the Prophet had meant at Badr. The army returned to Medina. The city received them with the particular mixture of relief and celebration that comes after a victory that no one had been entirely certain was possible. But inside the home of Rasulullah, the return carried a different weight. His daughter Ruqayyah had been gravely ill when he left. He had asked Uthman ibn Affan, her husband, to remain in Medina and care for her rather than march to Badr. It was the right decision, made with care, but it meant Rasulullah was not there when she died. He arrived back in Medina to the news that she was already buried. He had not been able to see her, not been able to say farewell. He had already buried 2 sons, Qasim and Abdullah, both in infancy. He would go on to bury 5 of his children before his own death. Only 1 of his 7 children would outlive him. His daughter, Fatima. The pain of outliving a child is a particular kind of grief that cannot be approximated by anything else. And he lived through it not once, but 6 times, each burial carried without bitterness, without a fracturing of trust in Allah, with only what he had always carried, the knowledge that complaint belongs to Allah alone, that sorrow returned to its source is not weakness, but the deepest form of reliance. He had said, "Those tested most severely are the prophets, then those closest to them in rank." He understood his own trials not as exceptions to the plan, but as part of it. And it was precisely because of this, because his life held real grief, real loss, real human weight, that 14 centuries of people who suffer have found something in his seerah that speaks to them directly. Not comfort offered from a distance, comfort offered from within the same fire. But loss was not all that came after Badr. There was also joy, a particular quiet, world-altering kind of joy. His daughter Fatima, the one who resembled him most, in face, in walk, in the depth of her character, was married. Her husband was Ali ibn Abi Talib, the same Ali who had grown up under the Prophet's roof, who had been raised and shaped by him from childhood, who had fought that morning at Badr against Walid and won. The marriage was simple, no extravagance, no display, but from that union would come Hassan and Hussein, the Prophet's grandchildren, his sweet basil flowers of this world, as he called them. The tenderness he showed those two boys is preserved in the seerah with such specificity that it could not have been invented. He would come down from the minbar mid-khutbah when he saw them stumbling toward him. He would go on all fours and let them climb onto his back. Once during sujood, one of them climbed onto him, and he extended his prostration, held it long past what the prayer required, simply so the child on his back would not be disturbed. A man once came to him and said, "I have 10 children, and I have never kissed a single one of them." The Prophet looked at him and said, "If Allah has removed mercy from your heart, what can I do for you?" The victories of Badr sent ripples outward in every direction. Not all of them were celebrations. Inside Medina, the political architecture that Rasulullah had carefully constructed since the Hijrah was beginning to show its first fractures. The city was not a simple place, it was layered. Muslims from Makkah, Muslims from Medina, pagan Arab tribes, Jewish tribes who had agreed to a covenant of coexistence, and beneath all of it, a current of people who wore Islam on the surface and carried something else entirely underneath. The Battle of Badr had demonstrated clearly and publicly that the Muslim community was not a temporary arrangement that would collapse under pressure. It had held. It had won against odds that should have destroyed it. And that realization, that Islam was not going away, changed the calculations of everyone in Medina who had been waiting to see which way things would fall. Among the Jewish tribes of Medina, one in particular made its position unmistakable first: Banu Qaynuqa. They were goldsmiths and traders, skilled and prosperous, with a fortified stronghold inside the city. They had entered the covenant agreed at the beginning of the Madinan period, a document that bound all parties to mutual protection and coexistence, with a clear understanding that no group would act against the others. The covenant was explicit. The obligations were not ambiguous. What happened to break it was not a military provocation. It was something smaller in scale and larger in meaning. A Muslim woman went to the market in the Banu Qaynuqa quarter. A Jewish man there, seeking to humiliate her, pinned the hem of her garment to her back without her knowledge, so that when she stood up, she was exposed. She cried out. A Muslim man who witnessed it killed the one who had done it. He was then killed in retaliation. What began as a marketplace humiliation became a killing, and then a blood dispute, and then something that could no longer be contained within the boundaries of the covenant. Rasulullah went to Banu Qaynuqa directly. He addressed them clearly: accept Islam or be aware that what happened to Quraysh at Badr can happen to you. Their response was not diplomatic. They said, "Do not be deceived by fighting a people with no knowledge of war. If you fight us, you will learn what real men look like." It was not a negotiation. It was a declaration. Banu Qaynuqa retreated into their fortress. They had 700 fighters, 300 of them in armor. They planned to hold their position, outlast the siege, and test whether Rasulullah had the will to press it. They held out for 15 days. At the end of those 15 days, they surrendered, not because they were defeated in open battle, but because the will they had tested was stronger than the will they possessed. They had broken the covenant. The judgment was expulsion. They were given 3 days to take their belongings and leave Medina, and they left, the first Jewish tribe to break the agreement that had governed the early Medinan community, and the first to face the consequence of that breach. But expelling Banu Qaynuqa did not quiet the tensions. It may have sharpened them, because the factions inside Medina that had been watching, the hypocrites, the doubters, those who had never genuinely accepted the authority of what was being built, began to understand that Rasulullah would not leave violations unanswered. And that knowledge made some of them more cautious and others more determined. Meanwhile, Makkah had not been still. Abu Sufyan had taken the leadership of Quraysh after the losses at Badr. He was a different kind of leader from Abu Jahl, more patient, more calculating, less driven by personal vanity and more by strategic interest. And the loss at Badr had not broken Quraysh, it had focused them. The grief in Makkah was real. 70 of its men killed, 70 captured, its most prominent leaders dead in the dust of a valley they had entered as conquerors. And that grief was being converted, deliberately and methodically, into preparation. Abu Sufyan had made a vow before the battle. He had sworn not to touch his wife or take comfort in any pleasure until he had answered what happened at Badr. It was a ritual oath of vengeance, the kind that an Arab leader of his standing took seriously enough to bind himself to it publicly. He gathered 200 horsemen and rode toward Medina. He did not engage the Muslims directly. He was not ready for that yet. Instead, he stopped at the outskirts, made contact with certain individuals from among the Jewish tribes for information, attacked a small settlement near Medina called Uraid, burned 2 homes, burned some palm groves, killed 2 Muslims he encountered, and then, when word came that a Muslim force was mobilizing to intercept him, turned and fled. 2 homes, some trees, 2 lives. In Mecca, he called it revenge for Badr. In the accounts of later scholars, it was given a name that reflected its scale and its humiliation. The expedition of the Sawiq being the barley flour his men threw from their packs as they fled, lightening their loads to run faster. The Muslims who pursued them found the ground littered with discarded provisions. That was what Abu Sufyan left behind as a memorial to his vow. But Quraysh was not finished. Abu Sufyan's raid was not a strategy. It was a gesture. The real planning had already begun. The grief from Badr, the pressure from the families of those killed, the injured pride of a city that had always understood itself as the center of the Arabian world. All of it was being channeled into something much larger. A campaign. Not 200 horsemen. An army of 3,000. They moved carefully. They gathered support from allied tribes. They secured provisions and equipment. They organized the force with the discipline that Badr had taught them was necessary. And among those who joined the Qurayshi army were people from outside Makkah who had their own reasons, old alliances, old grievances, a calculation that the Muslims represented a shift in the region's balance of power that had to be stopped before it became irreversible. 3,000 men against the community of Medina. When intelligence reached Rasulullah about what was coming, he gathered the Muslims for consultation. The question before them was strategic and urgent. Do they defend from inside Medina? Use the city's architecture, its alleys and compounds, its natural defensive advantages, or do they march out and meet the army in the open field? The Prophet himself leaned towards staying within Medina. His read of the terrain and the circumstances suggested that fighting from the city would give them advantages they would lose in open ground. Several of the senior companions agreed with him, but a large number, particularly the younger men, those who had not been at Badr, those who burned with the desire to prove what they were made of, pressed hard for marching out. They spoke with heat and conviction. They said they would not be seen hiding behind walls when an enemy came to their door. Rasulullah listened. He returned to his home. When he came back out, he was wearing his armor. The moment the companions saw him armored and ready, the men who had argued loudest for marching out felt something shift in them. Some of them came to him and said, "Perhaps we were too insistent. If you wish to remain in Medina, we follow you." He said, "It is not fitting for a prophet, once he has put on his armor, to take it off before Allah judges between him and his enemy." They marched. 1,000 men left Medina in the direction of Mount Uhud. Before they reached the mountain, 300 men peeled away from the column. They were led by Abdullah ibn Ubay, the leader of the hypocrites, a man who had never genuinely submitted, who had spent the years since Rasulullah arrived in Medina calculating how to retain influence in a city that was no longer organized around him. He gave a reason for withdrawing. The Prophet had not listened to his counsel to stay in the city. Since his advice had been rejected, he said, he saw no reason to continue, and his 300 men followed him back. 700 Muslims continued toward Uhud. At the mountain, Rasulullah made his dispositions with care. He placed 50 archers on a rocky outcrop on the Muslim left flank, a position that commanded the ground around it and prevented the Qurayshi cavalry from looping behind the Muslim lines. His instruction to them was precise. He said, "Protect our backs. Do not leave your position. Whether we are winning or losing, stay where you are until I recall you. Even if you see birds picking at our flesh, do not move." 50 men, one position, one instruction, absolutely clear. The battle began, and for a stretch of that terrible morning, the Muslims were winning. The Qurayshi lines were breaking, men were fleeing. The Muslim fighters pushed forward with the same force that had shattered the army at Badr. And in that moment of apparent victory, most of the 50 archers on the outcrop made a decision that would determine the outcome of the entire battle. They saw the Qurayshi camp. They saw what appeared to be abandoned spoils, and they decided the battle was over. 40 of the 50 came down from the position. Their commander, Abdullah ibn Jubayr, called after them. He reminded them of the explicit instruction. He reminded them of what the Prophet had said. 10 men stayed. 40 descended. Khalid ibn al-Walid, commanding the Qurayshi cavalry, watching from the flank, waiting for exactly this, saw the outcrop empty. He moved. The cavalry swept around the exposed Muslim left. They hit the rear of the Muslim lines from behind. The Qurayshi infantry, which had been retreating, turned back when they saw what was happening. The Muslim army was suddenly caught between two forces, and the formation that had been winning minutes earlier began to collapse inward. In the chaos, a cry went through the field, "Rasulullah has been killed." It was not true, but the effect of it was catastrophic. Men who heard it stopped fighting. Some sat down on the ground where they stood. Some fled. The momentum of a battle runs partly on belief, the belief that what you are doing matters, that the cause is alive, that there is still something to fight for. And in the space of a single false report, that belief fractured across the Muslim lines. Rasulullah had not been killed. He had been struck. A stone had hit his face, breaking one of his front teeth, cutting his lip, driving the rings of his helmet into his cheek. He was bleeding. He was surrounded by a shrinking circle of companions who had thrown themselves between him and the Qurayshi fighters, pressing toward him. Among them were men and women both. Nusaybah bint Ka'b, whose presence on that field and whose fighting that day has been preserved in detail by the scholars of Sirah, shielding the Prophet with her own body while wounded, continuing to fight while bleeding. Rasulullah, bleeding, surrounded, called out to his companions. His voice carried across the chaos. Those who heard it moved toward it. Gradually, a protective ring reformed around him. They began to move him toward higher ground on the mountain. The Quraysh pressed hard, but could not break through. One of the companions, Talha ibn Ubaydullah, used his hand to shield the Prophet's face from a blow and lost the use of his fingers permanently in doing so. He never recovered full movement in that hand. He considered it the finest thing that had ever happened to him. The Battle of Uhud did not end in the clean, decisive way that Badr had ended. The Quraysh withdrew without pressing their advantage to its conclusion, a decision that scholars have examined across centuries, with various explanations offered for why Abu Sufyan did not order a final assault on Medina itself. What is clear is that they left. And what they left behind was a Muslim community that had come closer to catastrophe than at any point since the earliest days in Mecca. 70 companions were killed at Uhud. Among them was Hamza ibn Abd al-Muttalib, the Lion of Allah, the Prophet's uncle, who had fought at Badr with a force that eyewitnesses described as barely containable. He was killed by a spear thrown by a man named Wahshi, who had been promised his freedom by Hind bint Utbah in exchange for Hamza's death. Hind was the wife of Abu Sufyan. Her father Utbah had died at Badr. What was done to Hamza's body after his death, the mutilation that Hind carried out in her grief and rage, was something Rasulullah saw when he came to the place where Hamza had fallen. He stood over his uncle and wept.